Today's engaging idea looks at our global future. At a time when each day seems to bring new global crises and more tragic stories of human suffering, few if any topics could be more timely. These events raise many questions. Two of the most important seem to be, first of all, where are we going? How do we assess our likely global future? And what does it all mean? On the whole, is human society advancing or, as it so often seems, going backwards? Joining me today is a person eminently qualified to help us think about these questions. Dr. Barry Hughes is the John Evans Professor at the University of Denver's Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. He's the founder of the Frederick S. Pardee Center for International Futures and has spent much of his distinguished career developing the International Futures Global Integrated Assessment Model. Dr. Hughes is the author or co-author of numerous scholarly books and articles on international issues and a great colleague. Professor Barry Hughes, welcome to Engaging Ideas.
Thanks, Jim. It's a real pleasure to be here.
My pleasure. So you've spent a long time thinking about and building tools to study future conditions around the world and countries around the world. I'm interested in your work and especially those tools. I guess the question is, how does one go about studying the future of countries around the world?
Well, in our case, Jim, we've developed a system called International Futures, a forecasting system. The acronym is capitals I and F, small s, IFs, to emphasize the if-then character of thinking about the future. We don't pretend to be able to predict any long-term trends and outcomes with great certainty. There's a huge amount of uncertainty around everything we do,
sure.
But we're trying to understand alternative possibilities and explore those. The IF system has a very large database, over 4,000 data series drawn from all the major international organizations, think tanks, databases for 186 countries, back to at least 1960 when we can do it. That's combined with a forecasting system of models, demographics, economics, education, health, energy, agriculture, the environment, infrastructure, and others, all in interaction with each other.
Now, are you building scenarios in effect, or is it something else?
That's fundamentally what we do. Even our so-called base case or reference run, the current path, is clearly a scenario because we know that the path we're on is not the path we're going to ultimately stay on. There'll be variations in multiple directions, in some cases huge. So everything we do is around alternative scenarios.
So who uses the results of your work? And it strikes me it could be important, but tell us more about the users.
Well, anybody making decisions has to think about the future. Any logical, serious decision takes into account the consequences. When you and I got dressed this morning, we were both looking at ties and suits because of what we're doing right now.
Right.
The decision makers have to think in whatever issue area they're in, whether it's national security or the environment or education, they have to think about the consequences of the decisions they're making. And those consequences are not just in one issue area, because these are interactive issue areas. They have to think about the synergies and trade-offs between what they do and what other decisions are being made and implemented. So decision makers in a wide variety of environments need these kinds of tools.
So this provides sort of a database, alternatives to sort of spur their own thinking as they begin to develop policies.
Exactly. In fact, many of the people using a system like this are going to have very rich mental models about how various global factors are interacting and dynamics are playing out. We have codified in the system such a mental model, basically. Ours is potentially different than theirs, almost certainly different than theirs. They can learn from ours by experimenting with it, by looking at the scenarios, by trying different interventions, and hopefully enrich their models. It's a thinking tool to a very large degree.
How interesting. Who uses this information? What kinds of people or organizations?
Well, in terms of organizations, the intergovernmental organizations are heavy users of this kind of tool and of IFS specifically. We've worked with the European Commission, the executive arm of the European Union. We've worked with the World Bank on projects, with the United Nations on a number of efforts. In fact, right now we have a significant one where we're working with something called the United Nations Development Program to look at what are called the Sustainable Development Goals, the Global Communities Goals for 2030. We have also worked with, we have a new project actually with the NEPAD, New Partnership for Africa's Development, an arm of the executive arm of the African Union, worked with the Inter-American Development Bank. In terms of national governments, one of the most interesting things from my point of view is as we supported some efforts by an organization called the National Intelligence Council, which is in many respects the peak intelligence organization of about 14 that we have in this country. And the National Intelligence Council every 4 years delivers a report to the president on global trends, to the incoming or returning president, and we supported 3 of those. We've also worked with governments in Peru and South Africa. We've worked with a variety of intergovernmental organizations, Population Services International, Water for People, which is based here in Denver, and other organizations.
I happen to know that the work at the Pardee Center is actually known all over the world, in some respects perhaps better than it's known here in Denver. You've made an enormous impact during your career. So your institute has developed this very sophisticated set of tools that are used all around the world. But at the end of the day, someone, some person or persons must look at the data, look at the models, the scenarios, and interpret what they mean.
Right.
So if we can, moving from the tools to this question about making judgments, trying to assess. I don't want to put you on the spot, but what framework do you personally use? You've been doing this a long time, and as you think about this, how do you make your own assessment of this?
I'm still working on that, Joe. It's been a 40-year effort, and I'm still learning all the time. But when I mentioned the different components, the different models in this system, economics, demographics, education, and so on, I tend to group the issues and systems of the world into 3 clusters. The first is human development. And by that I mean the individual level capabilities that people have, education, good health, a reasonable income. The second cluster is social development. And into that cluster I place our interactions with each other. And those are primarily in 2 subcategories. One is economic interactions in the market, and the other one is through via governance. And governance is not the same as government, it's the relationship between government and society, so there's a set of interactions. The third cluster is around the biophysical system and human interaction with that. And that is where sustainability issues and sustainable development comes in. Now those 3 clusters are important kind of aggregations of issues that are closely bound themselves, but obviously also have interactions across the cluster.
So to go through these, the first one you mentioned was human development. So let's talk about that a little bit. What global changes do you see in the areas, I think you mentioned education, health, income. What is your own take on progress or lack thereof?
I think that fundamentally we underestimate very often how much in progress we've been making in human development. It's a very optimistic story in many respects. with respect to education, what was the average number of years of education that an adult around the world had, formal education, in the year 1960? Most people don't know the answer to that.
And I'm in that group.
3.4 years of formal education on average. We're now up to about 8. And that number is rising steadily. That's a huge difference.
Certainly is.
If you think about the health measures, in that same year, 1960, the average life expectancy globally was 52 years.
52 years.
52, which is up considerably from the beginning of the century. It's now 72. And by the way, we're on track right now. The estimates of people who work especially in this area are that Hong Kong women will break the 90-year life expectancy barrier by 2030. So this is amazing progress. With respect to basic income levels in poverty, 1985, they don't go back as far. The percentage of people around the world who were living on less than what most people think about as $1 a day. That's an older measure. It's now $1.90 with inflation, but $1 a day was 45%
of the world?
of the world's population in 1985. Now, that's phenomenal, obviously. That number is now down to about 13% in a period of, 32 years.
Right.
And we're on track to continue pushing that forward. So the human progress has really been quite phenomenal. Now, there are clouds on the horizon, obviously, here, and the opposite side of the story, to some degree, quality of education is now an issue. In the health area, nutrition has advanced dramatically. We were at, globally, we were at something like 2,200 calories per day in 1960, up to 2,900 now. 2,200 is not much above an 1,800 more or less starvation level for most countries. Now the problem is not undernutrition, it's obesity.
Right.
So problems have shifted, but the progress is phenomenal.
Well, the next category was social development. So what do you see happening in that domain?
That, in my mind, is a much more mixed story. And I would guess if we read the news, it's a much more mixed story for almost everybody looking at that particular category. In economics, obviously, economic growth, per capita income have continued to go up pretty steadily and pretty much around the world. So there's some really good news there. But there are some significantly less good measures. One is income inequality. Within countries, there has been a significant increase in many, particularly high-income countries, in income inequality.
We talk about that in the U.S., of course, but is that a global phenomenon as well?
It's global to the extent that we're talking about within countries, because China, for instance, as it's rapidly advanced, has dramatically increased the inequality in a country. India is going through some of the same sorts of things now behind it. But if you're talking globally in terms of the average person around the world, or if you're talking about the differences between rich and poor countries, there's actually been quite a bit of convergence. I mean, China's growth has brought 1.3 billion people up towards the levels of the United States. They're still upper middle, not high income,
right,
but they're moving rapidly.
So in terms of a mean or median, the direction has been positive, but within individual countries, we could be seeing this separation of...
Right.
Yeah.
So we've got a very mixed picture there. Now, if we turn more to the governance side, we have had a number of areas where there's been clear progress made. There's a standard 20-point measure of democracy. And going back again to 1960, the average country was right at the middle, 10. We often call anocracy, between autocracy and democracy. Okay. Now we're about 13.5. But we've seen the reversals in Russia, the reversal in Turkey. We've seen reversals in quite a number of countries. And in the last 6 years, the Freedom House has said that the trend has actually reversed and we've gone down somewhat. So there's a mixed message
This
there.
is sort of the rise of illiberal democracies.
Exactly, and in some cases, almost a reversion to autocracy. All So that's a mixed measure. Now, take conflict or instability within countries. Okay. The number of countries, the portion of countries with conflict peaked around 1990 and has been going down in terms of the number of countries. But then we have Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the intensity of those conflicts. So there's a mixed image there also. And overall, I would say that social development category doesn't exhibit the same kind of clear-cut progress that we've seen in the human development category.
And then what about the area of I think sustainable development that you mentioned as the third broad category? What's your take on that?
On the whole, I think most of us would agree a lot of the trends there are negative. I mean, the three areas in particular that people tend to focus on in that category. One is global warming, and we know that we've increased the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from 280 parts per million pre-industrial up to over 400 now. It's going to be almost impossible to hold it to the 550 of the Paris Accord. We've increased the global temperature already by 1 degree centigrade, and we're probably on course to about 3, although there's a lot of uncertainty around that by the turn of the century. So that's one category. Second category is the one of water. In terms of water scarcity, there are now 40 countries in the world that are using more than 40% of their sustainable water flow. And there are 24 of those who are using over 100%. Now, how do you use over 100%? You draw down aquifers below recharge rates, and in some cases you're dipping into basically non-rechargeable water or fossil water, and that's clearly not sustainable.
Is that number growing, Barry?
The number of water-scarce countries, absolutely. I mean, there is some counter trend in terms of reuse of water, in terms of more sophisticated storage of water, in terms of desalination. But on the whole, the water demand is outgrowing a relatively stable supply on an ongoing basis. Now, the third subcategory in sustainable development is basically biodiversity. And you know, obviously, that we're in what we often now refer to as the Anthropocene, the era of geological, biological time, which is one that's dominated by human activity, and the extinction rate has gone up dramatically. So the biodiversity is going down. Now, there are counter trends in this area too. The growth of renewable energy forms is really quite dramatic. In terms of urban air pollution in high-income countries, we've done an increasingly good job. But on the whole, the story there is pretty negative.
So we have a category that's pretty positive, a category that's clearly mixed, and one that is perhaps on the negative side. If you take these three categories, these three domains, how do they interact, and if so, how? How do they relate to one another?
This is the crux of what I continue to work with after these 40 years. You and I both know, having worked in universities, how siloed knowledge can be in disciplines, and it tends to be to some considerable degree in the models around the world too, so that models within these issue area or groupings and then across them are less numerous than the ones within a single issue area. I don't think we understand nearly as well how these three are interacting and playing out. I mean, just on the surface of it, how can it continue? How can we look forward 50 or 60 years and have tremendous progress on the human development side and continued deterioration on the environmental side? We know from historians that there have been all kinds of civilization failures as a result of that feedback. So how can these things play out? Now, you asked me, how do they really interact? Let me give you just one or two examples if I can. In terms of the feedback from the biophysical environment, the environmental deterioration to the human and social environment. This is an area where there's actually been less work and we have greater uncertainty about than some of those things within those issue areas. But if we reach that 3 degrees centigrade warming by 2100, the range of estimates of impact that that has on our economies ranges from someplace around 3% to 20% a year GDP loss.
Good heavens.
And there are arguments that even the upper end of that could potentially be wrong, because we could reach tipping points where things accelerate and deteriorate because you have feedbacks that lead to nutrition shortages, which lead to internal conflict, which lead to more environmental damage. So we don't have as good an understanding of that as we would like. That's where the uncertainty and risk is particularly great, and that's where models like ours are still struggling, in all honesty. And again, we can't pretend to predict, but we can try to help inform.
It is easy to conclude, as a mere mortal, that these huge, vast global trends are beyond anything where we as individuals have a significant impact. But it strikes me that the public knowledge and concern is perhaps the most important thing. And so as you think about these issues, what kinds of key points or key questions would you offer to our viewers as things that they might think about, perhaps get engaged in at one level or another, but as they think about this global future?
I tend to think as we as citizens approach these issues, or decision makers approach these issues, there are I'm going to go back to 3 again, but 3 categories of things that we need to think about. One is, where do we seem to be going? What is the path that we're on? The second is, where do we want to go? What is our vision for a desirable future? And the third is, how can we bend the trends? How can we bend the curves? Now, going back to the first one, where we're going, that's what you and I have been talking about. And the uncertainties are great, particularly across these categories. But if I'm sitting around a dining room table, or a book club or whatever, and a glass of wine in my hand after a good meal, this is what I want to talk about. You know, where do we think we're going? And the images are contrary, as we've just suggested, coming from the new optimists on the human development side to the great pessimists on the sustainable side. On the second question, where do we want to be? That's also a matter of considerable debate, really, within society. We have those who are looking for lifestyles that are much simpler, that are less demanding of services and goods. And then we have those who are arguing that humanity needs to go all out. Technological development, go for the planets, go for the stars. We're on a course where technology will solve the problems. And so those visions of where we should be going are really quite different. And that in some ways is that's almost a harder thing to deal with than the first question. And the third one, how do we bend the curve? Well, that's what the Pardee Center is trying to help us understand. You know, where are the interventions that might work to improve the course on all 3 of these issue clusters, and do it in a way where there are synergies across some of the interventions, and try to diminish the trade-offs. But the International Future System is online. It's public domain. There's a little bit of an advertisement here, perhaps.
Please do. Where can folks look at this?
If you just search on the Pardee Center, actually pardee.du.edu.
Okay.
On that front page of that is a direct link into the International Future System. It has been set up exactly for the kind of question you're raising, for people who are not necessarily making the day-to-day decisions that affect the world, but are very much interested in these issues. They can go there, they can interact with it.
Terrific. Well, Dr. Barry Hughes, thank you so much for sharing your ideas on how international futures can improve the quality of public policy and your perspective on human progress. We hope you'll join us in the future as we bring more engaging ideas from the Academy to the community. I'm Jim Grismer. Thank you for watching.